She disappeared without a trace. But what really happened to Amelia Earhart has never been fully told. The official narrative, which everyone knows, is full of holes, inconsistencies, and uncomfortable silences. A bold woman, a pioneer in the skies, who challenged the impossible at a time when the skies were still the preserve of men. But on July 2, 1937, in the heart of the Pacific, something happened. And since then, the name Amelia Earhart has ceased to be just synonymous with courage. It has become one of the greatest hidden mysteries of world aviation. She set out on a mission to circle the world toward the equator, an audacious feat, meticulously planned. But as the Lockheed Electra 10E made its way over the deep ocean waters, signals began to fail, coordinates began to misalign, and then silence. Last contact with the Howland Island Tower occurred at 8:43 a.m. After that, nothing more. Total disappearance. No evidence. No body. Just emptiness. But why, to this day, do so many details remain censored? Why were documents from the original investigation kept under lock and key for decades? There are files that have mysteriously disappeared, maps that have been erased, audio tapes with unexplained interference. Proof of truth, perhaps, was deliberately buried. For years, governments tried to close the case with easy explanations. They said, "She fell into the sea. The plane sank. End of story." But what if this version was created to hide something bigger? There are experts who swear that radio messages were picked up after the disappearance, with a female voice asking for help. There are reports from residents of nearby islands who saw an aircraft land in secret. All of this was ignored, dismissed, swept under the rug. There is a photograph, for example, that emerged decades later. In it, a figure resembling Amelia is sitting on a pier next to a man, Fred Noonan, her navigator. In the background, a Japanese vessel. Image was quickly discredited by authorities, but independent investigators raised uncomfortable questions. Why ignore the similarity? Why hide the ship in the background which belonged to the Imperial Japanese Navy? The most explosive hypothesis suggests that Amelia was captured, interrogated, and possibly used as a pawn in a game of espionage. American spy? Hostage in enemy territory? Or accomplice in a secret mission? There are many versions, but they all have something in common, have never been officially denied with concrete evidence. And even scarier, some theories indicate that she never died, that she lived under another identity, in silence, protected by those who knew too much. Could this be the reason for the total disappearance of evidence? The missing piece may be right under our eyes. And as we delve into the hidden documents, the forgotten traces, and the silent tests, a disturbing truth begins to emerge. Before disappearing into the shadows of the unknown, Amelia Earhart had already made her name in history as something much greater than a simple aviator. She was an enigma in motion, a force of nature crossing the skies with a purpose that went beyond the limits of aviation. In 1932, when she crossed the Atlantic Ocean alone in her single-engine plane, she not only broke the sound barrier of the prejudice of the time, she defied everything that was said to be impossible for a woman. And when she landed, hours after a crossing marked by storms, mechanical failures, and the deathly silence of the open sky, Amelia was no longer just a pilot. She became a living legend. The newspapers carried euphoric headlines, crowds awaited her in the cities where she landed, and her image became a symbol of freedom, daring, and mystery. But there was something more, something that was not printed on the covers of magazines, but rather hidden behind the glare of the cameras. Earhart was reserved, restless, and carried in her eyes a curiosity that transcended borders. She collected old maps, read forgotten accounts of lost civilizations, and loved talking to explorers, scientists, and theorists who spoke about uncharted territories and hidden technologies. It wasn't just the sky that attracted her, it was the unknown, and the more famous she became, the more rumors arose. They said she had access to privileged information, that the government used her on discreet missions under the guise of her travels. Her flights were public routes, but her true intentions, perhaps they weren't so publicized. She was decorated by the White House, acclaimed by scientists and even military personnel. But with so much prestige, why did she choose the most dangerous route on the planet for her last expedition? The route that flew over strategic islands, military zones, and areas practically forbidden to civilian navigation. None of this was a coincidence, and the more we look at her historical achievements, the more we realize that her trajectory was full of signs. Signs that perhaps, from the beginning, Amelia Earhart was not just trying to fly around the world, but rather towards something that most of us would never discover. And that something may have been precisely what triggered everything that came next. Because behind the fame, the speeches, and the applause, there was a deep, almost rehearsed silence about the true reasons behind her choices, her maps, and her flights. And it is in this silence that the most disturbing clues begin to appear. Amelia Earhart's final mission was not just another flight, it was her greatest ever. A round-the-world flight along the equator, something never before successfully accomplished. Everything was calculated, rehearsed, strategically planned. A perfect plan, supported by engineers, navigation experts, and even military personnel. The Lockheed Electra 10E, her plane, was a true technological gem of its time. Reinforced, equipped with advanced instruments, and specially modified to withstand long stretches of ocean. But despite all this structure, something out of the ordinary began to emerge shortly after her takeoff from the territory of New Guinea, heading for the small and remote Howland Island. The weather forecast had warned of unstable formations, but the flight continued. As they advanced over the Pacific, radio signals began to fail, messages were cut off, and the precise location of the plane became increasingly nebulous. The last transmissions indicated confusion, disorientation, and growing tension in the cabin. And then, absolute silence. Nothing else was heard. Nothing else was seen. No crash was detected, no trace was found. It was as if Amelia Earhart and her navigator, Fred Noonan, had been erased from existence. And it is precisely this sudden erasure, this lack of traces, that makes the case much bigger than a simple plane crash. Because accidents leave marks, remains, evidence. But what we have here is a void. And what makes it all the stranger is that the site of the disappearance was among the most heavily monitored areas on the planet at the time, with an active military presence, radars, and ship traffic. How could an entire plane simply disappear in front of so many watchful eyes? Official investigations did emerge, yes, but they were full of contradictions, evasive answers, and inconsistent reports. Instead of clarity, more mystery, and documents that are now known to have been lost, images that were damaged, testimonies that were ignored. We are not just talking about a disappearance. We are facing something much deeper, a plot with elements of censorship, concealment of evidence, and possibilities that defy logic. Because the details of what happened in the last hours of the flight are, to this day, covered by a cloak of uncomfortable uncertainty. And the more we investigate, the more we realize that perhaps this flight was not just an aerial challenge, but a smokescreen for something much bigger that was about to be revealed. Something that could change not only the history of aviation, but the understanding of what was really hidden behind that final mission. The disappearance of Amelia Earhart fell upon the world like a silent bomb. The planet stopped. Headlines filled newspapers on every continent. Radio stations interrupted their programming to report the unthinkable. The most famous woman in world aviation had disappeared without a trace. The reactions were immediate and intense. The United States government launched the largest search operation in history to date, mobilizing Navy ships, Coast Guard planes, tracking experts, and even secret agents. But even with such a large task force, no wreckage, no sign of life, no fragment of the plane was found. The mystery, instead of dissipating, only grew. And with it, the first theories began to emerge. Conspiracy theorists, independent investigators, and even high-ranking government officials began to raise hypotheses that had not been officially disclosed. Why so much urgency? Why were so many resources mobilized in an almost desperate manner? Something else seemed to be at stake. The FBI itself was unusually involved, keeping confidential records, parallel investigations, and reports that to this day remain partially hidden from the public. It was unusual for a simple plane crash, even that of a public figure, to arouse such strategic interest. What exactly was the government trying to find or hide? Meanwhile, strange reports began to pop up around the world. People claimed to have picked up unusual radio signals. Residents of remote islands reported unusual military movements and flights at unexplained times. Blurred images emerged, documents were leaked, but were quickly discredited or disappeared without explanation. The world wanted answers but received only more questions. It was as if an invisible layer of censorship was being carefully applied to everything that might indicate something beyond the official narrative. And the more time passed, the clearer it became that we were facing a disappearance that perhaps had less to do with bad luck, and more to do with secrets. Because the amount of effort devoted to closing the case without opening the space for public investigation was, to say the least, suspicious. And while the eyes of the world searched for Amelia in the skies and the waters, perhaps the real clues were being hidden in secret archives, silenced voices, and intentional gaps in what seemed to be just a tragedy. But what would happen if these pieces began to be reassembled? If what was buried came to light? If what was considered impossible began, little by little, to make sense in the face of the evidence that insists on not disappearing? Because the world may have stopped at that moment. But the mystery, it was only beginning to take shape. The official theory, the one sold to the world as the definitive explanation, was too simple for a case so surrounded by inexplicable elements. According to reports released at the time, Amelia Earhart had gotten lost during the flight, ran out of fuel, and crashed into the Pacific Ocean, somewhere near Howland Island. A tragic accident, followed by immediate drowning. And that was what the governments decided to communicate to the public. The problem is that this version, although it seems rational, does not stand up to the most thorough analysis. Experts at the time had already raised doubts about the accuracy of the information provided by the control tower and about the real amount of fuel available on the Lockheed Electra. The radio signals, which supposedly stopped abruptly, in fact continued intermittently for days, being picked up by amateurs in different parts of the planet. This was never completely disproved, just ignored. Furthermore, the searches were directed based on assumptions and not on concrete evidence. No trace of the aircraft was found in the region indicated as the probable crash site. Not a single piece, not a slick of oil, nothing. And when it comes to a plane that had crashed into the sea at high speed, you'd expect something, anything, to come to light. But what did the government do about it? They called off the search and said everything had been tried. They closed the case. But was it really just a navigational error? A miscalculation of distance and fuel? Or was there something about that route that couldn't be revealed? The documents from the time were written in vague language, the conclusions were laconic, and the detailed files took decades to become public. And even then, several passages appeared with partial redactions, missing pages, and blacked-out dates. It was as if they were hiding something that could never be discovered. The accident theory served perfectly to close the case in the eyes of the public. But as time went on, it began to smell more like a smokescreen than a genuine explanation. Because if it had all been just a tragic accident, why so much effort to keep quiet? Why so much resistance to new investigations? And what's more, why do so many clues that contradict this version continue to be ignored, even after so many years? Each new detail that emerges seems to dig even deeper into the abyss of unanswered questions. The official story was hastily put together, pushed as truth, and shielded from questioning. But there is something in this narrative that doesn't add up, something that screams from behind the scenes of the public documents, and that perhaps reveals a reality that has been covered up since day one. But while the official version tried to silence the case under the narrative of an accident in the ocean, an underground wave of speculation began to spread. Theories considered too dangerous to be publicly accepted, but which to this day challenge the fine line between what is possible and what is forbidden. The most well-known and controversial of these claims that Amelia Earhart did not fall into the sea, but rather made an emergency landing in the Marshall Islands, then under the control of the Japanese Empire. Unconfirmed records indicate that local civilians saw a foreign woman and a man being taken into custody by military personnel. And these were not just rumors. American soldiers reported, years after the war, having found documents that suggested the presence of two unidentified prisoners at the same time. Coincidence or buried evidence? The Japanese government has always denied involvement, but documents that have come to light in declassified U.S. archives indicate that yes, there were internal suspicions about Earhart's capture. And here the story takes on a new twist. What if she was not just flying on a civilian mission? What if, behind that bold plan to fly around the world, there was a secret espionage operation? The 1930s were marked by growing geopolitical tensions. The Pacific was a sensitive stage, and flight routes could strategically fly over military points of interest. The route chosen by Amelia was considered strange by experts: remote areas, military control, intense surveillance. It was the perfect route to gather information, under the perfect disguise. Several investigators have raised this hypothesis. Amelia Earhart, the people's heroine, could have been recruited by the United States to observe Japanese positions before the war broke out. If this is true, everything changes, because her mission would no longer be merely historical, and would become a highly classified operation. And when an operation of this level goes wrong, the protocol is clear: deny everything. But the most enigmatic theory goes further. There are those who believe that she never died, was never a prisoner, and that she returned to the United States under another identity. Witnesses claim to have seen a woman who looked very similar to Amelia living discreetly in small towns in North America. One of them even appeared decades later with a changed name, similar features, and a compatible age, and she categorically refused to talk about her past. Photographic analyses were made, facial comparisons, voice patterns, but the results, as always, were inconclusive. Or, rather, hushed up. There was always an excuse, a forced explanation, a report that came out at the right time to close the case again. But behind the layers of denial, there is a pattern, a trail of omissions, archived files, and stories that should never have been told. Because when someone becomes more valuable as a symbol than as truth, perhaps silence is the only response the system is willing to offer. As the decades passed, as authorities labeled the Amelia Earhart case closed, a disturbing series of discoveries began to emerge in isolated corners of the world. Fragments of aircraft compatible with the Lockheed Electra model were found on uninhabited islands in the Pacific, many with clear signs of salt corrosion but curiously preserved enough for analysis. A piece of aluminum found on Nikumaroro, for example, attracted enormous attention from the investigative community. It was identical in size and composition to the side inspection cover from Amelia Earhart's aircraft. But when preliminary analysis indicated a high likelihood of a match, the object disappeared from the record. Officially, it was shelved for future study, but that future never came. And it didn't stop there. Human bones were found on the same island by a British expedition in the 1940s. The first report claimed that they belonged to a woman of similar height to Earhart. But a few years later, another report, this time with American interference, contradicted everything and said that they were male bones. Strangely, the remains also disappeared before a modern DNA analysis could be done, as if the truth was constantly being dragged back into the shadows. Old photos also surfaced, some found in forgotten archives or private collections. One in particular, mistakenly published in a Japanese almanac from the 1930s, shows a woman sitting on a pier next to a man, both with features that eerily resemble Amelia and Fred Noonan. In the background, a Japanese military ship. The image, soon after going viral among researchers, was deemed unreliable by government agencies. No conclusive study was done, no official investigation, just silence. To this day, independent investigators claim to have received threats when they tried to explore these leads. There are files that have been denied access to information under the Freedom of Information Act under the pretext of national security. But why keep documents about a missing aviator classified for more than 80 years? What lies behind this evidence that emerges and is then wiped off the map? The pattern is clear. Every clue that could redefine history is discredited, declassified, or simply disappears. We are not talking about coincidences, but about a continuous movement of concealment. Because these discoveries are not just historical curiosities, they threaten to tear apart the veil that has been carefully woven around Amelia Earhart since day one. And it is precisely in this fabric that the threads begin to come loose, revealing a web of secrets that time has not been able to completely bury. What if Amelia Earhart's disappearance was not an accident, nor a navigation error, nor even a capture? What if it was all part of a deliberate operation, a carefully planned secret mission that remains, to this day, beyond our reach of understanding? This is the hypothesis that many consider too fanciful to be discussed in public, but which persists year after year based on discrete clues, blocked files, and deleted reports. There are documents, never fully revealed, that point to U.S. intelligence movements around Amelia even before her last trip. Secret meetings with military personnel, visits to strategic locations, and sudden changes to the original flight plan indicate that there was something bigger at play. What if this mission had more than just geographic or scientific purposes? What if its objective was to collect data, observe bases, test communications, or validate air routes of strategic interest? All of this with a perfect facade. The national heroine in search of yet another historic record. But then comes the question that changes everything. What if the mission failed, or went too well? What if, instead of a tragic end, Amelia simply disappeared because she needed to? Some say she was relocated, protected, re-identified. Others claim that she lived for many years in remote locations under another identity, as part of an agreement to ensure her safety and absolute secrecy about what she really discovered. Small towns, unfamiliar names, women with similar accents, and an aversion to cameras have been reported in various parts of the United States, including in decommissioned military areas. Some investigations suggest that one of these women was buried under an assumed name, but her DNA has never been tested. A mistake? Or another piece of the puzzle that they never want to put together completely? This possibility, while disconcerting, is far from isolated. Historical records provide precedents for covert operations involving convenient disappearances, false identities, and interagency cooperation to keep certain truths from the public eye. And Amelia Earhart's name appears in more than one of these records, always shrouded in confidential classifications, always accompanied by terms like strategic, sensitive, and not released. What if she was not just a courageous pilot, but rather a central figure in a much deeper narrative, one that links power, geopolitics, and occult science? What if what she saw, heard, or carried made her an inconvenient witness? someone who could never return to public life. Because the silence surrounding her, instead of diminishing over time, has only grown denser, more uncomfortable, more programmed, as if her disappearance were just the first act of a story not yet authorized to be told in its entirety. What drives someone to challenge the skies, knowing that they may never return? What invisible force moves a human being to cross oceans, face storms, risk everything on an uncertain route for a destination that may not even exist? When we think of figures like Amelia Earhart, we are not just talking about a woman in an airplane. We are talking about an archetype, the symbol of the trailblazer, of the restless spirit who refuses to accept the limits imposed on her. And if there is one thing that history shows us, it is that these great trailblazers almost always have one fate in common: disappearance. And I am not talking only about physical disappearance, but about dissolution into mystery, transformation into myth. Amelia was not the first, nor will she be the last. The world has always had its adventurers who dared to touch the forbidden, question the invisible, seek what was hidden. But perhaps there is a price for this, and that price is precisely planned oblivion, forced silence, the trail erased by those who do not want certain discoveries to come to light. When we look back, we see that the most daring have rarely had simple endings. Many have disappeared without explanation. Others have been discredited, ridiculed, or silenced. It is as if there were an invisible line drawn by greater forces, a line that, when crossed, places the individual in a new dimension, where the truth ceases to be public and becomes the privilege of the few. Were these trailblazers destined to disappear because they saw too much? Because they touched what they should not have? Or are they somehow part of something greater, something that time, science, and history itself are not yet ready to reveal? And this is where the connection becomes personal, because all of us, on some level, carry this impulse to seek what is beyond. We have all felt that chill down our spines when we realize that there is more to the world than we are told, that behind the official versions, there is a universe of hidden layers, parallel realities, deliberately silenced information. Amelia Earhart, when she challenged the skies, perhaps was not just trying to complete an aerial route. Perhaps she was trying to break the barrier between what is shown and what is hidden. And if that is the case, then her journey was not interrupted. She simply entered another stage, a stage that continues to echo to this day, in the files that are not opened, in the reports that are ignored, in the photos that disappear, in the names changed, and in the truths that are never told in so many words. Because sometimes, disappearing is the only way to continue existing within a secret. And now that you know every fragment of this story, every censored detail, every silenced theory, the question that remains is inevitable. Do you really believe that Amelia Earhart was just the victim of a plane crash? Or could it be that behind all of this there was something much bigger, an unauthorized mission, a strategic secret, a truth so shocking that it had to be buried under decades of official versions? Because when the evidence disappears, the reports are ignored and the files are locked away, we are not just faced with a mystery. We are faced with a cover-up. And all of this leads us to believe that Amelia may have touched something forbidden, something that still bothers those who control history today. If you've made it this far, it's because you also feel that there's something wrong with this narrative. So I want to invite you to be part of this ongoing investigation. Comment below, "I want the truth." This comment is not just a sentence, it is a position. It is your way of saying that you are paying attention, that you do not accept the first answer, and that you know that behind every silence there is something that needs to be revealed. Subscribe to the channel now to continue following this journey of mysteries, revelations, and stories that defy logic. Leave your like if you stayed until the end, because this helps a lot to spread this content to more people who are also searching for the truth. And most importantly, the next video is already on your screen. In it, we will talk about Is Amelia, historical figures who disappeared without a trace, and who may have been part of a much larger pattern. Click now and follow me in this investigation, because the truth is closer than it seems.